the implementation of economic reforms through Operation Vulindlela. This morning we are joined by the Director General in the Presidency, Ms. Phindile Baleni, on my left. On my right, Ms. Vuyo Guma, who's the Chief Director for Microeconomic Policy at the National Treasury, and on my far left, Mr. Rudy Dix, who is the head of the Project Management Office in the President's office, also the co-head with Vuyo of Operation Vulindlela. So without taking up too much time, I'd like to invite the DG to kick us off with opening remarks, and thereafter I'll hand over to Vuyo and Rudy to take us through the presentation. After that, we will then open the floor to questions, and yeah, thank you. DG, over to you.
Thank you, Vincent. Good morning to the ladies and gentlemen of the media, joined in that protocol. So today we are releasing a detailed progress report on the implementation of the economic reforms that we have conducted through Operation Vulindlela, which reflects the progress which has been achieved across government during this administration, the 6th administration. Operation Vulindlela is a government-wide initiative coordinated by the Presidency as well as National Treasury, which focuses on accelerating the implementation of structural reforms with a high impact on economic growth and job creation. As the report demonstrates, significant progress has been made in reforming our economy since the President announced the establishment of Operation Vulindlela in October 2023. 2020, in October 2020. In the energy sector, regulatory changes have resulted in a massive increase in private investment in electricity generation, with a pipeline of more than 22,500 megawatts of confirmed projects in development. The reform of the energy system has now far advanced, with the passage of the Electricity Regulation Amendment Bill and the establishment of the National Transmission Company of South Africa, amongst other key milestones. We are already seeing the impact of these reforms in reduced load shedding and in the proliferation of new energy projects across the country. In the logistics sector, greater private sector participation in port terminal operations has been enabled, and the freight rail network is being opened to competition. These reforms will allow more volumes to be transported via rail and support export growth while making our logistics systems more efficient and competitive. The Freight Logistics Roadmap, which was adopted by Cabinet in December last year, continues to guide the implementation of these reforms. In the telecom sector, one of the earliest milestones in the economic reform program was the completion of the spectrum auction, ending a more than 10-year delay and contributing to reduced data costs and improved network quality and reach. In the water sector, the backlog of water use licenses, which stood at well over 1,000 applications at some point, was cleared, and the license application system has been improved to reduce processing times. Concrete steps have been taken to strengthen institutions in the water system, to improve regulation, as well as to encourage investment in the infrastructure. Finally, reforms have been implemented in the visa system to encourage the growth of tourism and to enable the economy to attract the skills that it needs to grow. The e-visa system is now available in 34 countries, while visas have been waived for visitors from 135 countries. The recommendations of the Work Visa Review Task Team, which was completed last year, are now being implemented, including the establishment of a trusted employer scheme and a points-based system for work visas. Our economic challenges are complex and deep-rooted. However, the progress that we have made in implementing the economic reforms through Operation Vulindlela give us confidence that they will be overcome. While the impact of these reforms may not be immediate, they will be significant. Perhaps the most important lesson of Operation Vulindlela is that we can achieve significant progress by enabling collaboration across government and putting in place clear time-bound plans, and by establishing systems to support delivery and ensure accountability. More than 15 government departments and entities have contributed to the implementation of these reforms through new ways of working and a singular focus on implementation and results. Above all, this report demonstrates that government is fully committed to staying the course on the reform agenda and removing constraints on growth. At this point, ladies and gentlemen, I will ask Mr. Rudy Dix from the Presidency, as well as Mrs. Nomvuyo Guma from National Treasury, to provide a detailed overview on the progress report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, DG. Rudy, are you kicking us off? Thank
Yes, yes, indeed. Thank you, Director General Pindile Balene and Mr. Vincent Magwenya, and my colleague, of course, Ms. Nomvuyo Guma, who have, I think, DG, in this instance, we always say one of the successes of being able to implement a program is the ability to work collaboratively with different departments. And in this instance, I think the center of government, Presidency and National Treasury, working on such an important part of a program that's part of the overall economic kind of implementation. Remember, this is in the context of, as you said, in the context of the economic reconstruction and recovery plan. And so I think, lots of lessons learned, but successfully being able to implement a program of this nature is not always easy, but the results, of course, speak for itself. And so again, just to remind colleagues that, the way we've approached this, as DG has said, is the establishment of a kind of delivery unit approach, which is Operation Vulindlela and a collaborative effort between National Treasury and the Presidency. But I think sometimes it's missed that OV, being a collaborative effort, can only succeed when it works with the implementing departments. And that's always been an important and strong partnership, as you say, DG. Working with 15 departments, director generals, with deputy director generals, chief directors, entities, ministers as well, in ensuring success. So the success of OV is largely dependent on the commitment that has been brought by the implementing departments. And of course, this approach was supported by the President and Cabinet to accelerate reforms that are pretty important for economic growth. The approach was to focus on four key primary functions: identify measurable objectives, as DG had said, tracking progress on the priorities, and that's quite important for us so that we are able to see whether we're making progress and whether there are particular sets of interventions that we require where progress is slow. Investigating and intervening. This is always a difficult task, but it was one of the most important objectives that we're able to, where progress is not made, do we require and provide support and technical assistance? And there are many instances where we've done that to departments and entities, including providing the overall political leadership and guidance, and then providing high quality information. Of course, OV in its existence has been able to, on a quarterly basis, provide updates and reports as part of our commitment to follow through on transparency and the level of accountability. And that's quite important for us, both for the public and for political princes. I mean, what makes us different, as many had asked us initially, was that, it was not intended to provide an intervention on every single thing that government needed to do, but it was very focused narrowly on a specific set of efforts that would have the greatest impact on economic growth. And so, of course, an ability to spend resources and focus creates dissipation. It allows us to do a lot of different things, but the objectives and the outcomes are not necessarily felt. And so the importance of high impact economic reforms was the key focus. Our ability also to move in an agility was quite critical. We set about not necessarily forming a bulky structure. We worked on the individuals that were currently in the public service, but we were also flexible in bringing in experts from outside. And that agility has helped us to be able to transcend the traditional just internal focus, but experts outside for us to be able to move on the reform. And more critically, it's a government-wide approach, where As I said, we worked with ministers, departments, and entities to implement and did not take away the responsibility of the implementation, which is sometimes misunderstood. OV doesn't do implementation. OV has the ability to coordinate and focus on the reform, but the implementer is eventually the department or entity that is responsible. And then, of course, as we said, we've been able to draw on the dedicated Vulindlela unit with expertise, both public and private, monitor, escalate, provide progress updates, and this is quite important. So just a quick snapshot of where we are. And again, as we said, we had focused on 5 core priorities. We did this on the basis of modeling exercise that the economic policy unit had given us, that, you know, if we focus on these 5 things, would this have an impact on growth? And we know that it would. And so, of course, estimations are, 3 to 3.5% over the next 10 years on baseline. So it's important for us to look at these, 5 desired outcomes. Remember, the focus has been on the supply of electricity stabilized, reducing the cost of telecommunications. We'll provide updates for each and every one of this, sustainable water supply, competitive and efficient freight transport, and having a visa regime that is able to attract skills and grow tourism. So our focus has always and primarily remains on these 5 areas. We, of course, added in a few other areas, but this was the mainstay of the reform program that we did. And as DJ has said, I mean, the methodology was very, very important. So it's intense, labor intensive. It's working with departments, working through problem solving, being able to get to the problem if there are blockages for us to be able to achieve a particular set of reform. And this was quite important. So we went, about, systematically in dealing with this. We prioritized and we did planning, and of course, we set around multi-stakeholder consultations and ensuring buy-in, provided support for developing strategies and mapping delivery, rigor testing implementation, and ensure ownership by implemented. So I think it's just, again, important. Driving execution, another important area of work that, if you set a particular set of objective around the reform, can we execute it? What do we require to be able to support that? And particularly in you look at the 5 areas, they sometimes involve not only one department or entity. They have a cross-cutting nature. And of course, being in the center of government where National Treasury and Presidency is able to coordinate, it fits well in that role of being able to coordinate and ensure that the implementers are able to deliver, provide technical support. We'll show that again. External partners that have expertise that we're able to bring in, and that agility is quite important. And identify and solve problems as we go along. And then, of course, the most important aspect is there an outcome? Is there performance? Do we see things being done? And of course, the impact. And we've got some interesting information on this. So critically collect, validate, analyze, and synthesize data. This has been always an important part of our dashboard that is publicly available. Performance management systems, and our ability to be able to track that. Stock takes, reflections on where we're at with different departments has been an important part of it, and monthly review and reporting to the President and, of course, ministers. And this has been an important part. I think what the slides doesn't say is that more importantly, the technical team between Vuya and myself was quite important, but the ability to have the political backing has been fundamental. And both the Director General, for example, the Director General in the National Treasury, and the President and the ministers have been important political backers in ensuring that the reform program is politically supported and it gets the highest priorities going forward. Vuyo, over to you.
Thank you, Rudy, and good morning, everyone. So as we come to the end of phase 1 of OV, we have this opportunity to reflect on the progress that we've been able to make over the last 4 years. We're very proud to be able to say that a total of 89% of the reforms that we committed to undertake have either been completed or are on track. Of course, with long-term reforms of this nature and programs of this nature, you don't have a natural overlap between when the phase of a program comes to an end and when the reform might be completed, and that's why we still have some things that we are still pursuing and intend to take forward in the 7th administration. If you go to the next slide, we'll take you through in a bit more detail around where these reforms actually sit. So there are two reforms where we haven't either ticked them off or made sufficient progress to be able to satisfy ourselves that these processes are on track. One relates to municipal electricity distribution. There are currently plans underway to accelerate that through NECOM, but in this phase we weren't able to gain the traction that we would have wanted. And then secondly, around reviewing of the fuel price formula. Some of the reforms that are on track, so you'll see the light green there refers to reforms that are on track but slightly delayed in terms of how far we would have liked them to progress at this point, and that refers, to things like the procurement of new generation capacity in terms of the IRP and developing a strategy for the devolution of passenger rail. Then there's 6 reforms that are on track and meeting the timelines that we had anticipated and set out for ourselves, and these are things that are being taken through primarily through structures like NECOM and the NLCC, so implementing third-party access to the freight rail network, for example, or the restructuring of Eskom, where we think that things are progressing well, and these will continue to roll on into the next administration. On the next slide, you then have a sense of the reforms that have either been fully completed, and that is the dark blue. We have 16 of these, and we're happy that that actually is the bulk of the dashboard. So these are all of the reforms that are completely done and dusted, where we will not have to revisit them, or there are no final bits of work that need to be done. And then we have in the light blue 4 reforms that are completed or substantially completed, but where 1 or 2 things still need to be enacted in order for those reforms to be fully felt on the ground. I'm going to hand back to Rudy now as we take you through each one. Sorry, after this, I'll hand back to Rudy as we take you through each reform area in greater detail. So what the dashboard gives you a sense of is the progress that we've made to date. What this slide attempts to give a sense of is what does that actually mean in substance. So it's all good and well to say, well, 89% of reforms are completed or on track. But what does it actually mean for South Africans and for our economy? According to the analysis that we've done, and we do present this in the book, we've been able to unlock an estimated 500 billion rand in new investment that will filter through into the economy as a result of these reforms over the next few years. Some of the specific changes that we've been able to enact, like changes in energy regulations, have led to 22,500 megawatt pipeline of private investment that we estimate could inject about 390 billion if all of those projects actually hit the ground. Another example in telecommunications is a substantial reduction in the cost of data as a result of the spectrum auction and accompanying reforms that we enacted in the telecommunications sector with the department. And then, as Rudy already alluded to in the introduction, a significant reduction in the number of days to obtain a water use license, in addition to the fact that backlog that originally stood at over 1,000 licenses has actually been eradicated. So Rudy, I'll hand back to you.
Thanks, Vuyo. And perhaps the most important reform is the reform on energy, and this is quite an exciting process of a combination of the reforms and the work that DG heads in the National Energy Crisis Committee. I think what it does do is that it, the kind of timing has been, quite unique in that we were able to deal with the energy crisis and do the reform program at the same time. And I think, remember, it is about stability and securing energy for the future. So the 5 key things that we focused on specifically was, of course, the Electricity Regulatory Act, which as it is right now has been passed by the National Council of Provinces and is, of course, sent to the President for assent. That is currently, in the process of being looked at. And really the bill, as many are familiar with it, is about setting up a national transmission system operator that would be responsible for the system itself, balancing, as well as, of course, creating a competitive market. In summary, simplified, that's really what it is. And we also in the process, of course, in dealing with the market code, which is quite important for a competitive generation space, and that's quite critical. Linked to that was the reform in relation to the establishment of the National Transmission Company in South Africa. Now, we know this has been completed as part of the Eskom restructuring that was adopted by Cabinet in 2019. It has, of course, will be a full subsidiary, and its independent trading, its trading will commence from July 2024. A lot of work that we've put in, DG's guidance has been quite important for us to be able to get that across the line, and that's an important step in the first aspect. So having that transmission company to be able to manage a competitive market through what is reflected in the area bill is quite critical. We've done a whole set of work both as part of the National Energy Crisis Committee and under the OVA reform on procuring additional generation. This is through the IPP program, and you've seen accelerated release of these programs. For example, a whole set of bid windows in December 2023 for battery, gas, and for renewables, and again in March 2024. This is over 10,000 megawatts of additional capacity that has been released through the auction IPP program, and of course will be quite critical to help us. But the regulatory reforms that we introduced, as Vuyo had said, under Schedule 2 of ERA was one of the most significant reforms that has been there. As the National Energy Crisis Committee and OVI, we track with the Energy One-Stop Shop the projects that are there. We now know that there are over 130 projects in different stages of approval, and totaling an estimated 22,000 megawatts, that's 22 gigawatts, and as Vuyo said, totaling over 390 billion rand. So many of these projects are, for example, are in the process of getting the grid allocation or in the process of applying for registration, but they have all been approved by the developers, and so of course it's important for us to use this as an important indication. And this is quite critical for us because this is the first step, other than the IPP program, to allow for private sector generation capacity through the embedded generation program, where the off-taker are not only Eskom but many, and I think this is quite important, and you see this coming through. And then of course the work that we've done, particularly with Treasury around the incentive program, seen, for example, from 2022 to 2023, to over doubling the amount of rooftop PV to 5,000 megawatts, and that's because of the subsidy and the financing, the tax incentive and the financing mechanism that has been introduced to the Energy Action Plan. Again, this has been an important part. Now, think about these reforms as a combination of two things. One, to be able to ensure that we deal with the energy supply, and secondly, to be able to ensure we deal with the reform program to create energy stability and security for the long term. And that's the combination of why these reforms are so important and pertinent, and why we've made the kind of progress that we've seen, which is phenomenal in respect. This just provides you data points. The one on the left-hand side is the NERSA registration process, and you can see and track that relative to when we started the reform and think through quarter 2, 2022 with 2021. Very, very small number of, significantly low number of registrations take up, as we did the change to Schedule 2, you could see that, and that's of course steadily going through NERSA registrations. This is the data that we get from the grid access unit on the right-hand side from Eskom, and it just shows the applications in the grid connection process. So there are two steps there, but generally speaking, this is what is referred to when you ask for a budget quote to connect and you pay a fee, but it gives you an estimation around what is in the budget quote phase. That's the second last phase, because then you move to registration and then you achieve financial close and then you construct, if one simplifies it in a way. So important to look at this data sets to show why we think the reform has been critical for private sector. Logistics has been another constraint, and energy, similarly to energy, we've been focusing on this quite fundamentally. And again, there are quite important reforms here, particularly on creating competition and allowing for private sector participation both in the port and in the rail space. 4 areas of focus that we've had over here. First, of course, is the freight logistics roadmap that we published during the course of this year and was adopted by Cabinet towards the end of 2023, outlining a clear path for reform of the logistics sector, and I think this has been quite critical. Again, 2 objectives of that. Firstly, to support the turnaround plan of Transnet and deal with the short-term operational challenges that are there. And secondly, to create a sustainable logistics sector where Transnet is at the center, but allow for competition and allow for private sector participation. And those two combinations of operational immediate and long-term medium reforms are quite critical for us, and the logistics roadmap adopted by Cabinet points to that. Secondly, of course, again, as we move through the parliamentary process, the ERT bill has, of course, been passed by the National Assembly and is currently, of course, waiting to be assent by the President. Again, we don't have a single regulator in the transport sector. This is an important bill. It's an important regulatory institution that we need to set up for the entire transport sector, and it's quite critical for us to be able to ensure that it also assist in the reform program. You know, we've made concrete steps, and Transnet has been quite in the forefront of driving open access to the freight rail network. Literally this is an important and fundamental reform. Transnet has, for example, established what is called TRIM, Transnet Infrastructure Manager, and that is basically the infrastructure manager, which is the separation of operations and infrastructure to allow for competition on the rail network. That's an important step, and they're in the process of ensuring that. Secondly, the TRIM has issued a network statement, which is the first step towards open access, and in that, ideally, it describes the state of the network, but more importantly, it gives the access charge price, right? And literally, that is currently, as we know, going through a public consultation process. Comments have been received up until the 20th, and it's going to be important for us, of course, to get to a network statement that would allow us to be able to say to private operators, here is the state of the network, this is the access price, it is open for third-party access. Those steps are important to follow so that we have complete buying and have that. And then, of course, in the port space, some significant reform. One of the first steps in creating a private sector participation in the Durban Container Terminal 2, which is the largest container terminal on the African continent. Of course, what has happened is that the partnership will be in place soon, but Transnet has, of course, announced that, and that has been finalized as we speak. Similarly, we've done the same thing as we've done in rail, is to set up a separate, separation between operations and infrastructure, and the Transnet National Port Authority is the infrastructure manager for the ports. Again, important as a step towards creating competition and open access on the port terminal for private sector operators. Vuyo, I think this is just, these two reforms have been our biggest focus because they are the biggest constraint in economic growth, and you can see why we spent a bit of time on this to explain why this is quite important. So some significant progress, lots of areas work in progress, but I think, I think we're moving in the right direction, and the legislative framework supported by the immediate interventions that DG Baleni drives, which is on the National Logistics Crisis Committee and on the National Energy Crisis Committee, is important to deal with some of the more urgent turnaround. But a combination of immediate operational interventions with long-term reform is the approach that we've taken.
Thanks, Rudy. We can go more quickly then through the next couple of slides. So in terms of telecommunications, the intention here was to ensure that the reforms actually raise the quality and reduce the cost of telecommunications. And so key to this suite of reforms was actually the conclusion of the spectrum auction, of course, that allows then for network operators to actually invest in the rollout of 5G and frees up additional spectrum for improvement of network quality. Adjacent and linked to this reform was two regulatory changes, so the rapid deployment policy and then the standard draft bylaw, which were both gazetted in 2022-23. There's the combination of these is intended to streamline the regulatory approvals and frameworks for the rollout of telecommunications infrastructure. And then finally, in this area, we had Cabinet approving the next generation radio frequency spectrum policy, which then further frees up spectrum for additional use by, amongst other things, creating the possibility of a secondary market for spectrum. So in terms of telecommunications reforms, this is one area where we were able to tick off all of the reforms, with the exception of that final switch off of the lowest frequency spectrum bands, which is on track to take place by the end of this year. On the next slide. In terms of water, the intention here was to support the department in making reforms that would actually ensure a quality water supply both now and into the future. The first big reform that was undertaken in this area was, of course, the re-engineering of the water use licensing system linked to the backlogs that existed at the time. And we were able to support the department in doing that and are continuing to support them as this system ramps up to full operation. We also have had some significant regulatory changes. The NWRIA bill has been passed by the NCOP and will soon land on the President's desk for assent. And what this bill attempts to do is to set up a new SOC that will manage investment into water infrastructure, speaking to that need to re-engineer that sector for better performance in the future. There have also been changes, for example, to the raw water pricing strategy and some additional changes made by the department, the setting up of an interim water regulatory council in order to ensure that the standards and quality that are monitored in the water sector are actually maintained. One of the other big reforms that we were able to tick off in this area is actually the invigoration or the republishing of the water quality monitoring systems, and I think that has had a significant impact in how people are thinking about the importance of water and really shining the light on the importance of making sure that these regulatory changes take place in the water sector. On the next slide. Visa reforms was our final priority area, and we have been able to tick off with the department quite a few of the reforms that actually sit in this domain. The first big reform that we were able to tick off was the updating and release of the critical skills list. At the time that we undertook this reform in partnership with the DHA, that list had not been updated in 10 years, and the frustration on the ground for people who are looking to import critical skills into South Africa in order to drive their businesses and drive growth was palpable at the time. We also were able to support the department in the rollout of the e-visa system, initially to 14 countries, and now it's available in 34 countries. Countries that do not have the e-visa system applicable in their area typically have the benefit of a visa waiver. And so we've been able to significantly streamline access for visitors into South Africa. What the department has latterly done, and I think this just came out in the last couple of days, is the revised immigration regulations. These give effect to the recommendations of the work visa review, amongst other things, the introduction of a points-based system, which we think will streamline processes in the department and reduce some of the variability that had been evident in the adjudication of applications prior to the rollout of the system. And then finally, the Department of Home Affairs linked to this has also started to process applications for the Trusted Employer Scheme. The idea here is that for big businesses or businesses that are heavily reliant on skills that they can't find within South Africa, they will be able to almost pre-register with the department and to do a whole lot of background checks with the department. That would mean that they will have a simplified route then going forward if they want to bring skilled workers into South Africa, and that would significantly reduce the processing times that they are faced with. That concludes, Chair, presentation for today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vuyo. Thank you very much to Rudy. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll now open the floor to questions. And I believe we'll also be receiving questions from those who are joining us via the live stream. So patients will read those questions to us. But we'll start here in the room and take questions. Okay. First question. Yes, madam?
Ntokozo from Newsroom Africa. I don't know if we can get any insights just on the reforms delayed, which from the last updates was at 20%, or it's at 20% this time from 12% in December, and then the reforms facing significant challenges, 0% from 17%. Do we have insights on what we're doing right over that last quarter or so?
Thank you. I'll take another question. Gentleman at the back, over you, sir.
Thank you for the opportunity. I'm from The Citizen. My name is Thabiso Mthembu. My question is for the overall performance of Operation Vulindlela, how would you rate it out of 10? And secondly, do you think it's going to be effective going forward, especially considering the next administration? Thank you.
Thank you. Mhlekazi.
Thank you. I've Mtila from ENCA. The reforms look good on paper, 89% achieved, but for the last 4 years, Operation Vulindlela has been operating. Realistically, what's happened? We're talking about 500 billion rand investments, yet we have a 32.9% unemployment rate. We're talking about reforms in the water sector, where still today we have almost half the water leaking via the infrastructure. I can go on, but why aren't these reforms materializing, especially in the last 4 years, to something substantial that can be seen? For example, economic growth 0.6 in 2023. This doesn't say much on what Operation Vulindlela seems to say it has achieved.
Okay, thank you. Hilary, I'll come back to you on the next round. Can we take this round? I don't know, Rudy, would you like to start? Okay.
I don't know that it's so much a question of what we did differently. I think that OV is an experiment. You know, we were not brought into government to be delivery execution specialists. And so when we started out and there was a lot of comment around the slow pace of reform, a lot of that was establishing the team, it was establishing the structures, it was establishing the protocols. When do you escalate? When do you attempt to diffuse a situation or just engage bilaterally? So in any process, the longer you're at it, the more momentum you can gain towards the end. I think it's a little bit unfortunate, as I was saying, this is almost an artificial stop. It has to be, because it's the end of this administration and we must report on what we have achieved and not achieved now. But to the extent that many of these are just going to continue to roll over, you know, it does present a bit of an odd break. So it wasn't so much that we did things differently. I think we got better at what we were doing. A lot of what we had to do at the beginning, to Rudy's point, is that we had to build the relationships, because this is a collaboration. And at the start, OV didn't have a track record, OV didn't have a reputation, people weren't entirely sure what OV could bring to the party. And the more we've worked with departments, I think those concerns have eradicated or evaporated. What we would hope for is that in the 7th administration, to the extent that there's a continuation of OV, and that remains our base case, with all of these systems and relationships in place, we anticipate we'd be able to hit the ground running and do a lot more in the next phase than we've been able to do in this phase.
I mean, I think that, Tabiso, you rate us. We gave you the report. I don't want to risk rating us, DG. So you do that. And of course, it speaks to self, but I think, Aviwe, sorry, I missed you. I think Aviwe probably puts it much more, you know, in the dynamic thing. So you do this stuff, what happens to the economy and employment? And that's of course always a very difficult question if you're doing the reform, because there's an expectation that you want to see these reforms impact immediately. You want to see the change in growth, you want to see a change in investment, you want to see a change in employment. So the first question for Tabiso, the second question for Tabiso, yes, there is a lot of work that we require to get across the line. As you can see, this is progress updates that we have. There's a lot of additional reforms that we're going to have to look at also. So certainly in the new administration, we would want to continue the Operation Vulindlela. We think it's successful. We think it is about ensuring that we carry through the reform, because eventually, sometimes we don't see the results immediately, but carrying through the reform has a significant impact on the economy in the medium to long term. And I think this is something which is quite important for us to recognize. So we recognize that, you're not going to see employment changes immediately. You're not going to see growth changes immediately. You may see some of the investment changes come through, and that's quite important. So track the data, which we do, around the investments in energy. So that's quite critical for us to look at it. Do the 390 billion rand where we've made that reform for private sector investment, is it coming through? Are we seeing construction and build? And what we do see is that on that data, it is coming through. But it's not giving you what you're asking for, the 32%. And I think staying the course is important. Now, staying the course is quite critical because here is one example. We stayed the course on energy, and we're now 50 plus in not having load shedding. And that's directly because of a whole set of interventions that we have managed with the DG in short-term interventions around the National Energy Crisis Committee through implementing the President's Energy Action Plan and the reform program. Because, you recall, we announced that, the President announced that in July 2022, we stayed the course, and eventually during the course of last year and this year, we've seen the benefits come through in supporting ESCOM around plant performance, maintenance. We've seen the interventions around this incentives come through where households were able to move onto rooftop PV. We see the interventions come through with the change in regulations relating to private sector generation. That has a significant impact and confidence for those who want to make investment decisions that are critical, because if there's no energy security or an indication of moving towards energy security, no one is going to invest. So I think of it in that way. So there are immediate short-term claims. I think probably the most successful has been on the energy front, given where we sit and the interventions that we've done, and that is immediate. So hopefully we will see, as we sustain and carry through the reform to its logical conclusion and we take it to its end, that much of the investments, the growth, the employment opportunities will come through. We have to do, Aviwe, I mean, remember the structural reform program is one part of the overall economic reconstruction and recovery plan. There's a whole set of other interventions from a demand side in the economy that's going to be quite important. The work that we do around industrial policy and the master plans, for instance, the stuff that we do on skills are critical. So think of it as a whole combination of different things in a basket that requires to get us going. This is an important step that deals with the supply side and deals with the structural challenges to invest, to get economic growth, to get competition going, and we think this is an important step. We may not see it immediately, we do see it on energy, but we will see it eventually over the years to come.
Thank you, Rudy. Just to give a more certain answer to Thabiso, Operation Vulindlela will continue into the 7th administration, since President Ramaphosa will be leading that administration. I'll take the next round. I'll start with Hillary. Hillary?
A couple of questions. Hilary Jaffe from Business Day. First, could you just clarify some numbers for me? You mentioned 22,500 pipeline of what I understand to be embedded generation, private sector generation, plus bid window, the IPPs under the bid windows is 10,000. In other words, is the total pipeline, if you like, 32,500 of megawatts of potential private power coming on stream over what period? So that's my first numbers clarification. And the second numbers clarification is you talk about 500 billion of investment, and then you talk specifically about 390 billion of investment in energy. Is the 390 part of the 500? So that's just on the numbers. And the second, asking for a few more numbers, have you done any updated projections on the likely impact of the reforms which you have executed so far on GDP or GDP growth, and over what time period and what sort of sequencing could we expect? And third question, if I can take advantage here, what next? Yeah, someone has already, you've talked about how you will expect to continue into the new administration. Have you looked at a new set of priorities that will be on your list for the next administrations, and can you give us a flavor of what those might be? Thanks.
Great, thank you for those questions, Hilary. I'll take another question. Dogozo, you want to come back?
I'd like to add to that
Okay.
question of adding to the priority list, but also just to circle back on the critical skills list. It is ever changing and new skills are being added. How does that then affect that priority area? It is something that's supposed to then be concluded and done with, but if, you know, we are seeing new critical skills being added, how does that then affect things?
Great. Is there another question? Can we take those then? We've got quite a number of questions from Hilary, so who?
Okay, so it's going to be a bit of a mixed bag between the two of us in terms of how we respond, Hilary. So the 390 is part of the 500, but the 500, so the 390 is a moving target because there are constant additions to that pipeline and we keep getting information from NERSA, but it's not possible to keep re-estimating that total OV impact. So that comes from the impact analysis that OV has done. At the time, the embedded generation pipeline, that investment impact had stood at about 250. So it was half of the 500. Now you could anticipate that that 500 probably is much bigger. We just weren't able to get re-estimated numbers, but that is an exercise that we're busy with, and we will have the opportunity to share that a little bit later. In terms then of the impact on GDP growth, I mean, we do try and put these as scenarios into almost every budget book. We had to sort of, we had to stop for a bit because even though the reform agenda is important, there are other scenarios that one wants to consider and put into the public domain. But what we've tried to do is break it down. So we've previously had energy upside scenarios or logistics upside scenarios. Some of them lend themselves to modeling outputs a little bit easier than others. But continue to look at those scenarios that we publish, and we are actually engaging with some of our development partners to do a proper assessment of OV, and we look forward to publishing that a little bit later in this year. So in terms of the impact of GDP growth, that's looking forward. These reforms, though, were drawn from the 2019 paper and then found expression again in the ERRP. So in terms of what you're looking for around the sequencing and the long-term impact, that still remains sort of over a 10-year horizon. We anticipated that could raise GDP up to a 3% level again, or an additional 1.6, 1.7 to the baseline as it stood at that time. In terms of the new set of priorities, we are seized with that exercise at the moment. I really don't think it would be appropriate, though, to kind of preempt. Obviously, these will be the president's prerogative to decide on. But I think if you go back to some of especially the things that the Treasury has been saying, there is a consensus around what the key economic blockages are in South Africa. And so I think it would probably be a subset of that list of things. Certainly, they all feature on the list that we are considering at the moment. And then finally, on the critical skills list, yes, it is ever changing. So what we ticked off there in blue was the fact that there had been a sort of decade of no updates, and that clearly was hamstringing business. Since then, there have been several updates, and you're right, skills dynamics in the economy will always change. And that's why we have, with the department, are making a move towards a points-based system, so that you have some things that change less frequently, and then in the background you can have critical skills updates that would happen, every year or every 2 years. And I think that is the process that has already been agreed on between the DHA and the Department of Higher Education and the Department of Labour.
Certainly, you're correct. It is separate. So it's 22,500 megawatts, which is embedded generation. And then through the IPP program is the additional 10,000 that has been put out. You could count even rooftop PV. That's an additional, doubling of it, right? And that's quite important. And then because we kind of track all the interventions that would bring on megawatts. In the National Energy Crisis Committee, DG provides a set of all of them. And then you could have count, in this year, of course, both Madupe and Kusile units come on as well. So you could count plant performance as well in relation to additional megawatts coming on. So yes, it looks a pretty picture, and importantly, they don't all materialize immediately as energy does, right? It's over a steady period. What we do see is, what we have seen is a significant start in beginning of 2023. You know, you see that come through. We'll see it again come through in 2024. Big jump in 2025, 2026, 2027, as many of these projects do come on stream and are adding to energy supply. That's why I think, I mean, we're quite positive with that. It also gives Eskom a bit of time and a bit of buffer and space to do the deep-seated planned maintenance on some of its midlife power stations. But, you know, the reality is the reforms that we've done has allowed us to be able to bring all this kind of diverse, you know, technology agnostic generation megawatts onto the grid, and we'll see that come on going forward. I think we just answered the 390, so that's quite important. Sorry, thanks.
Thank you. Just to round up on some of the conceptual areas. So on the economic growth point, I mean, it's a valid point, but we all know that there are lead and lag factors that impact that show the impact of the work that you do in the real economy. There are other aspects of the economy that must be sorted out, but overall, I think think tanks are beginning to say that there are green shoots that are showing in the economy of the country, taking into account the other macro factors that have impacted the ability of our economy to work. Just the final point I would like to talk to is just the adaptive governance that we moved to under the Operation Vulindlela approach, Ntokozo. That is what we did differently in the system. So by the time we are reporting now, indeed the system has developed its character, but the key features of the system is that we work differently, where government typically works in silos. We break those silos, create third spaces where we enhance ability of people to collaborate. We then create new routines. We configure to win so that we are able to make sure that people collaborate and are sitting in the same room. If they need to, they are able to hand things to each other, and as opposed to the standard, go to that department, go to that department, go to that department. And finally, this mechanism enables agility that would enable us, for instance, to deal with the changes that would occur in the critical skills based on the changing nature of work and those kinds of aspects. So this is, as Vuyo has said, a different way of doing things, experimenting with a different way of doing things. Like all governments are challenged with delivery. We were seeking to ensure that we are able to drive delivery from the center, and this methodology, at the very least, we have seen some results, and it's a methodology that we will continue with. Thank you. Thank you, Vincent.
Thank you, Tichi. Patience, have we got those questions from colleagues joining us via the live stream?
Yes, we've received a question. It's two questions from Terence. Terence is with Engineering News, and the first question is, what impact will Eskom proposal to reserve grid for public procurement, IPPs, have on the 22.5 GW private PPA pipeline? And the second question is, are you concerned that a suboptimal electricity regulation amendment bill has been rushed through the parliamentary process, and that immediate amendments will now be required should the president sign the bill? That's all that I have for now.
Great, thank you. Is there a question from the room before we tackle those two questions? No? Oh, Hillary, yes?
Sorry, just one last question. Rudy spoke about being a kind of delivery unit, but equally that you're not I think you said you're not a sort of execution unit. It has been suggested by some commentator that actually OV needs to become a full-on delivery unit. Now, what would that look like that's different to what OV is now? And has any consideration been given to becoming a full delivery unit within government?
Okay, thank you, Hillary. Rudy, can we tackle that question from Terence?
Yes, Terence, yes, of course. The basis of the reservation and the public participation process that NERSA has given is going to be quite important. And largely, as you've seen in the application, it's really around it's what you do around the grid reservation assessment that was done for the Cape provinces, and that's the 3,400. Of course, at the time of releasing bid window 7, this was quite critical because 3,200 of the 5,000 megawatts were for Windows. So the reservation capacity is specifically around the unlocking of a grid through the assessment and the curtailment that was done for it. So it's important for us in terms of broader public interest that we do ensure that we don't have a similar situation that had happened for bid window 6, where the bid potentially fails. And this is quite critical. This does not impact on the existing 22,500. Much of them have already gone through BQs. We'll have to assess how much of them are applying for wind capacity and at what stage they are. But I certainly think that a lot of them have already gone through that phase, and grid capacity has been allocated. Remember, it's not preservation for the entire grid system. It's specifically for the section that relates to the wind capacity and the reservation that has been requested for the Cape provinces in relation to wind. The second point that you relate to around, irritable, the president will have to consider that in his decision as we go forward. DG, I want DG because DG's got some really good thinking about this one on the delivery unit.
No, thank you very much. I think what will inform the nature of the OV stroke delivery unit is going to be the assignments on the tables. There is the classical delivery unit that was established during Tony Blair's era, but it was subsequently amended in of itself because circumstances changed in the very country where it was pioneered. So, and across the world, there are just different variations of a delivery unit. So what we can promise is that we will have the most appropriate delivery unit for our country based on the priorities that we have identified and understanding the inherent factors on the ground that would work with the current system of government and governance. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, okay, yeah.
I mean, the thing that's made us probably successful is our agility to be flexible. Now, we could have a long debate about it, but bureaucracies are bureaucracies, right? And so you have a very little ability to move and be flexible, bring in the skilled people, bring in technical people for us to be able to do that. I think in our assessments of delivery units globally, I think that has been quite an important part of that flexibility to adapt and to move with changing conditions. Our ability to be able to deal with crises, interventions are quite important, where we were able to expand and do it quite quickly. And I think that's an important factor. The second important factor, of course, is just the political support and of course, direct line to the Director General and the President. These are important things for us to be able to ensure that you're able to, from the head of the public service and from the head of the country, to be able to support the delivery mechanism going forward. So there are lots of debates, lots of views around these kind of things. I think what's been probably successful is our ability to be agile in a very bureaucratic environment, and that's really been our ability to bring in experts, work with different people, adapt, change, focus on technical support for departments, working together collaboratively, as DJ said.
Great, thank you. Is there another round? Patients, happy? I think everybody's happy in the room. That then concludes this media briefing. We will share the presentation. We will also make available the DG's remarks, and Rudy and Vuyo will make themselves available for any follow-up media engagements, should there be request. And just before we go, I have one announcement to make. President Ramaphosa will on Friday sign into law the National Council on Gender-Based Violence and Femicide Bill and the National Prosecuting Authority Amendment Bill in a ceremony that will take place here at the Union Buildings. The National Council on Gender-Based Violence and Femicide Bill will lay the foundation for a multi-sectoral approach to gender-based violence and femicide in South Africa. This landmark legislation is a critical step forward in ensuring the safety and security of women from all walks of life. The National Prosecuting Authority Amendment Bill amends the National Prosecuting Authority Act of 1998 to, among other measures, provide for the establishment of the Investigating Directorate Against Corruption. The Directorate will, over time, incorporate the existing Investigating Directorate, will have investigative capacity with priority given to particularly serious criminal or unlawful conduct committed in serious high-profile or complex corruption, commercial or financial crime. So colleagues, please do join us on Friday at 10:30 for the public signing of these two bills. Thank you.